Hi guys, so let's talk about Weber within the context of Belizean society. In essence, Weber is saying that a rational society is a society that finds more efficient and effective ways of doing things. Rationality really is a way of thinking about doing things much more effectively. So when you're doing your videos, think about how Belize has become more effective when doing things within the society or within structuring the society. We're going to talk a little bit about the elements of rationality within a society in a bit. But first, let's look at rationality itself. Let's take a simple example as making corn tortillas. So traditionally, corn tortillas were made by hand, were placed in the comal, were taken off the comal, and then were ready to eat. As society evolved, so did making tortillas, so that now we have tortilla factories, and instead of spending all that time making tortillas, making the masa, waiting for the comal to heat up, you can just go straight from work to the tortilla factory, pick up the tortillas, take them home, and they are ready to eat, and you can go ahead and enjoy them. It is much more effective and much more efficient. Therefore, tortilla factories, Weber would say, are very rational, and it is a more efficient and effective way of consuming and getting and producing this product. So that is just one example of rationality within the Belizean society. When you do your video, you're going to look at society on a whole. You look at its structure, you look at things that have been implemented to make it more rational or less rational. So when you do your video, you don't necessarily need to argue that Belize is a more rational society. It's quite possible that we are more rational in some areas and more traditional in other areas. And that is perfectly normal of a society because different facets of society move at different paces. So in the same way, our society, which is Belizean society comprised of multiple other societies, can be seen as differing in terms of rationality and efficiency. So if we look at an area like Spanish Lookout, for example, we might say that Spanish Lookout is a little bit more rational, or a whole lot more rational, depending on your perspective, than a small village in Toledo where there's hardly electricity. So we would say that there's a difference in rationality between these two sub-societies of the overall Belizean societies. There are so many ways to present your arguments for rationality in Belize. However, regardless of what your position is, ensure that you cover the various elements of a rational society. So we're going to look at the elements of a rational society, and it is your job to figure out whether these elements are found in Belize, and if they are, to what degree. Let's get started. All right, so here we have our basic little slideshow on the elements of a rational society. Our first element of a rational society are distinct social institutions. As a society grows, so does it start to form very specific social institutions. So if we look at it, combining a little bit of Lenski here now. So Lenski stated that we start with hunter-gathering societies, and those societies evolved into post-industrial societies. The more a society involves, the more people there are. Because there are more people, then everybody doesn't have to focus on getting food. In a hunter-gatherer society, everybody focuses on basic things like gathering food, keeping protected, staying warm, etc. The more people you have, the less people have to work on the area of food production, and so there's more time and space within the society to start to look at other things. For that reason, as societies evolved, we started to have astronomers and priests and educators and entertainers, for example. All of these comprise specific social institutions. In our modern societies, we have specific social institutions. We have religion, for example, the law, education, politics or government, the family, and economy, just to name a few. There are, of course, more social institutions. And the more advanced a society is, the more social institutions there are likely to be. Another element of a rational society are large scale organizations. The bigger a society is, the more efficient and effective it is, the more it creates large scale organizations. When we think of a large scale organization, we are thinking of something like Google. The more efficient societies, of course, the more rational societies are much more technologically advanced. That's another key factor uh, that has to do with rationality. The more rational a society is, the more likely it is to have technological advancement. And so we have Google, for example. Google is quite a part of that post-industrial society where there's high technological use. And for that reason, we have Silicon Valley being a whole thing in places like the US. These large-scale organizations very often don't just operate within that same society. Instead, they operate in other societies as well. In the case of Google or Coca-Cola, for example, they operate in other countries. So you can have a large-scale organization within the society itself, so within the country, and you can have a large-scale organization that is so big that it expands beyond that country. An example for Belize might be the Roe Group of companies. If you take a look at the Roe Group of companies, there are multiple business and companies under this particular group. So for Belize, this would count as a large-scale organization, as well as Bowen and Bowen. However, there are many other organizations, not just in Belize, but all over, that you can examine as part of a rational society. Another example of a rational society, or another aspect, I should say, of a rational society is specialization. So the more specialized, the more efficient a society is, the more specialized its persons are. So for example, if you want to work in technology, you can go work at Google and you can work in a specific area of technology. Same thing with any of these organizations and any social institution. Let's take a look at Belize now. If you are in Belize, you can specialize in a certain area, but there are, of course, certain challenges. Take a look at your lecturers alone. There is a limitation in terms of our courses. Ideally, your courses would be taught by a highly specialized instructor, and you would have highly specialized courses. That's not entirely the case because, again, there we are not quite there yet as other countries in terms of specialization. That's not to say that we don't have specialization in Belize. Of course, we do. We have educators, we have anthropologists, we have sociologists, we have psychologists, we have diplomats, we have persons that specialize in politics, we have chemists, we have lots of people that work in specialized areas, highly specialized areas, and are highly trained for those areas in which they work. Of course, there is not a surplus like in other much more larger countries because we are a smaller country. There are less people here. And remember, the more people, the more specialization. The less people, the less specialization, less division of labor, less social institutions, etc. So specialization is one element of a rational society. Let's take a look at another element of rational society: efficiency. Overall efficiency, such as personal discipline and awareness of time, are elements of a rational society. Now, how much awareness of time is healthy or good or best for a society is entirely up to that society. Let's take an example at let's take a look at South Korea. South Korea went from being a country receiving aid to a country giving aid in a very short span of time. However, that kind of achievement and that kind of rationality comes at a price, to the point that suicide as a result of overwhelmed persons because they're working so much is very common. In addition to that, death due to overwhelmed persons, so being overwhelmed within the workplace is actually very common in South Korea because of that high demand within the workforce. So, yes, personal discipline is, of course, an element of rationality, but how much is necessary for a society is entirely dependent on a society. For your task, you are to look at personal discipline and awareness of time within the Belizean society. How rational are we, and how much does it match our society? You can argue it both ways. Of course, we probably don't want to be South Korea. However, we have our own awareness and elements of time, which are actually particular to countries like the Caribbean and Latin America. We genuinely have different perceptions of time that leads us to say things like we're on Caribbean time or Belizean time. There's lots of research out there about how we perceive time, and we perceive time differently sometimes by the society that we live in. Living in Latin America, so being Latin American or Hispanic, being Caribbean, and Belize is both, allows for a different perception of time because of our specific society and the ideas that exist within this specific society. I encourage you to read up about that as much as you can because it is very interesting. Let's look at some other elements of rational societies. One is technical competence. The more rational society is, of course, like I said, the more technologically advanced it is. And with that comes specific technical competence for each of these areas. So, take an example as online learning, which is what we're doing. In a much more rational society, these videos would be edited by a professional. Instead, they're edited by me with very limited knowledge about how to create and edit videos, and I'm really just trying out here. So, technical competence is an element of rationality. Hopefully, as the University of Belize becomes more rational, we can have persons that do the editing, and you could hopefully have better videos in your courses. And lastly, we have impersonality. Impersonality is an element of rationality, and you can look at it from various perspectives. Impersonality, like awareness of time and personal discipline, are not always a very positive thing. It can be argued both ways as something negative and something positive. While, yes, impersonality is an element of a rational society, it is not congruent, particularly with our society. Let me explain a little bit about what impersonality is. Impersonality is, in essence, when you go to work and you don't really know anybody at work and nobody really knows you. The larger a society is, the more people, the more impersonality there is. That is not particularly congruent with certain aspects of Belizean society. Certain areas of Belizean society have more impersonality than others. For example, large cities like Belize City being our largest might have much more impersonality. You can be and exist within Belize City with mostly people ignoring you, letting you go about your business. There's a whole lot less of walking down the street and saying good afternoon to every person you meet and that sort of thing. And also within organizations, some organizations have greater impersonality. Maybe within the department, yes, you know people, but it's only within that specific department. Other departments exist and they don't know you. You go to work and you are just an employee. So that's what impersonality is in a nutshell. People interact less, it is less personal, less close than maybe what you are used to. We tend to see impersonality, particularly when we go to large cities. So if you've ever been to Mexico City, Guatemala City, or cities in the US, you will see large scale impersonality. We're not very familiar with this because Belize is a very small society. And depending on where you work, people generally know you well. And depending on where you come from, where you live, there is less impersonality. For example, if you come from a village, chances are that when you're walking down the street, you say good afternoon, good morning, you greet the people that you meet down the road. But then when you come to places like Belize City and you're in downtown Albert Street, there's swarms of people going both ways. At least there definitely were before the pandemic. And so you would not be saying good afternoon, good morning to everybody that passes you by. And there we see impersonality in action in a sitting like that in Belize City that I'm giving you the example of. So these are our basic elements of a rational social organization or a rational society. Ensure that when you are doing your video that you cover these elements.